Try to relax, forego the stress. Something ain't popping and you look a mess. Here's a suggestion, I hope it works for you. You better chill.
Ooh. You are listening to the Women in Jazz Series Philadelphia with moi, your hostess with the mostest, Khadija Renee, Area Jazz Diva. Welcome to this episode. Hey, yes, I have a delightful surprise for you today. I will be featuring on this episode the wonderful, multi-talented female pianist, classical and jazz pianist, Miss Hazel Scott, also known as Miss Hazel Scott Powell. So, welcome to this episode. Fortunately for us, we will be having the privilege of interviewing her prodigy child, Mr. Adam Clayton Powell III, her only child and her only son. So, stay tuned for that. In the interim period, I wondered what you think about when you think about the word jazz. Do you see a group of men playing together either in trio, quartet, or big band formats, wailing on those instruments, the drum, the piano, the bass? Maybe there's even a horn or a horn section, and they're composing tunes rhythmically, syncopation being used to its high definition, and the musicians all working fervently together to make this composition sound so great in an original format and an original rhythm. Yes, that's normally what we think about when we think about the word jazz. Men playing music that's originally composed and created here in America, America's only original historic music of jazz. Yeah, truly I do love it, don't you? Well, I wanted to let you know that this particular series does not focus on that. It will forecast and showcast the elephants in the room. Yes, the women in jazz. Those women who didn't get their props, but they were there, right alongside their male companions, creating, playing, making music, composing, arranging, directing, and leading bands. Yes, that's what we plan to do with this series. Let the world know that women also were very vibrant in the creation and the procurement of the music of jazz in the United States as well as around the world. Women like Melba Liston, Marion McPartland, Mary Lou Williams, Vi Red, Sherry Marico, Shirley Scott, and today's featured artist, Hazel Scott. Yes, this show will clearly show the dividing lines and show the obstacles these talented women, underrated women, face to play the music they love. Discrimination and sexism were the fabric weaved into their lives and their passions. But they prevailed, and some even skyrocketed to fame and notoriety. However, many remained obscure. But if you were to ask them, they would all say they had a ball. So today we will feature a shero from our neighboring town of New York City, NYC, the Big Apple, a woman who took the world by storm with her inimitable talent, Miss Hazel Scott. A recording and TV star, jazz and classical pianist, composer, and band leader. Let's dive into that just a wee bit more, because today we'll learn all about her life and her music by exploring her bio and sharing some of her music. And we have the good fortune to have here with us today one of her living descendants, her only son, Mr. Adam Clayton Powell III, who you'll see a little later in the show. All right, let's get down to it, shall we? Miss Hazel Scott. She was born in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. So on June 11, 1920, Hazel Dorothy Scott was the only child of R. Thomas Scott, a West African scholar from Liverpool, England, and Alma Long Scott, a classically trained pianist and music teacher. The family moved to New York City when Hazel was 4. And by the age of 8, she had been admitted to Juilliard School of Music to further her musical studies. Imagine that, at age 8. But the minimal age of admittance in Juilliard at that time was 16. But the admitting professor was so impressed by this 4-year-old talented child that he admitted her as his personal protege. Yeah. And as a teenager, she performed on piano and trumpet with her mother's Alma Long Scott all-girl jazz band. So by the age of 16, Hazel Scott regularly performed on radio programs for the Mutual Broadcasting System of that day, gaining a reputation as a hot classicist. So let's take a listen to a tune that displays how well Hazel jazzed up the classics from her album, Jazzing Up the Classics. Let's hear a tune, and we'll be right back. In the mid-1930s, she performed at the Roseland Dance Hall with the Count Basie Orchestra. Yeah, love me some Basie. Yeah. Her early musical theater appearances in New York included the Cotton Club Review of 1938, Sing Out the News, and the Priorities of 1942. Beth Scott was one of the best what they call stride boogie-woogie pianists, like Eugene Blake and others. She was definitely one of the star boogie-woogie pianists and was also a Gershwin interpreter. Took all of his tunes and jazzed them up. Throughout the 30s and the 40s, Scott performed jazz, blues, ballads, Broadway, boogie-woogie songs, and classical music in various nightclubs of that heyday of jazz. From 1939 to 1943, She was a leading attraction at both the downtown and uptown branches of Cafe Society. Hey, Google that, look that up. Cafe Society was the place to be, the venue in the heyday of jazz in the 1930s and the 40s. Her performances created national prestige for the practice of swinging the classics. So by 1945, Scott was earning $75,000, which in today's money is like $1,000,000 or $1,000 a day for a whole year, making that kind of money. So that tells you she was rich. She was featured in Cafe Societies from Bach to Boogie Woogie concerts in 1941 and 1943, where? Carnegie Hall. So let's take a moment and pause to listen to one of those tunes that she was well known for when the period of taking classical tunes by all the great Bachs, Schuberts, etc., and jazzing them up. From her LP called Great Scott, let's listen to a tune called Soon. So, Miss Scott made her debut in Hollywood. In addition to Lena Horne, Scott was one of the first Afro-Caribbean women to garner respectable roles in the major Hollywood pictures. She performed as herself. She refused to take on the stereotypical demeaning roles of the time that they designated for black women in film, such as maid and other demeaning character roles. Some of her films were I Dood It, an MGM classic. Yes, you heard me right. I said I Dood It, D-O-O-D, Dood It, 1943. Broadway Rhythm, MGM Studios, 1944, with Lena Horne. And the otherwise all-white cast of The Heat's On, Columbia, 1943. So you film buffs who watch stations that feature black and white classic movies, hey, Google that. The Heat's On and Columbia Pictures, 1943. Something to Shout About, another Columbia picture, 1943. And Rhapsody in Blue, a Warner Brothers production in 1945. So we're talking about an Afro-Caribbean woman who not only was a musician, but an actress. Oh, but let's not forget, she could also accompany herself on piano. So she had a very nice, stately voice where she would play and sing on television and in film. Well, some of you TV buffs might know that Hazel Scott was the first person of African descent to have her own television show. Yeah. In the 1940s, when racism and discrimination was just blared right in your face. But she had her own television show. It was called The Hazel Scott Show. Right? It premiered on a local television network called Dumont Television Network in July 3rd, matter of fact, 1960. I'm sorry, 1950. 1950. You hadn't even got to the 60s yet. So Variety reported, Variety was, of course, a performance magazine or newspaper that reported that Hazel Scott has a neat little show on this modest package network. It was most engaging being Scott herself. She didn't have to take on a role of any other persona. She played herself, the classical pianist who could jazz up classic and sing. As a matter of fact, she was well known for playing two pianos at the same time. Alicia Keys knows perfectly well who Hazel Scott is. As a matter of fact, Hazel Scott is one of her mentors, one of the people that she looks up to, and always wanted to be able to play two pianos at the same time. That's where she got that from, Miss Hazel Scott. All right. So at this time, we're going to take a nice pause, a brief intercession here to listen to another one of the tunes by Miss Hazel Scott, singing and playing at the same time. Yeah, now we know where Alicia Keys modeled herself after. Love Me or Leave Me. Let's begin.
Love me or leave me, let me be lonely. You won't believe me, but I love you only. I'd rather be lonely than happy with somebody else. You might find the night time the right time for kissing, but night time, my time for just reminiscing, regretting instead of forgetting with somebody else. There'll be no one unless that someone is you. I intend to be independently blue. I want your love, but I don't want to borrow. Have it today, give back tomorrow. My love is your love, there's no love for nobody else.
So remember when I was talking about, can you imagine being an African American or Afro-Caribbean person in America in the 1930s and 40s? The hardships and challenges they must have endured, especially those who were artists and were trying to promote themselves as performing artists. So you couldn't ignore the fact that you were living in tumultuous, unjust times. And so that was the time of the civil rights period moving forward into the 60s. There was something going on called blacklisting. And Miss Scott had long been committed to civil rights. particularly in Hollywood, where she was very well known. She refused to take roles in Hollywood that cast her as a single maid. Can you imagine a classical pianist being casted as a single maid? Wasn't going to happen, not for Miss Scott. When she began performing in Hollywood films, she insisted on having final cut privileges, and when it came to her appearance, she made sure that she was the final determiner of that. In addition, she required control over her own wardrobe so that she could wear her own clothing. If she felt that the studio choices were unacceptable, she made sure she was the final voice in deciding what she was going to look like. So her final break with Columbia Pictures, I think she made at least 3 pictures with them, but something happened to cause them to separate. And Mr. Harry Kahn was, the president of Columbia Pictures at that time. And it involved a costume which he felt stereotyped blacks. And she refused to perform also for segregated venues. And so when she was on tour, she was once escorted from the city of Austin, Texas, by Texas Rangers. Imagine that. Because she refused to perform when she discovered that black and white patrons were seated in separate areas. Talking about using your art form to make a social justice statement. She did that. Wow. She said, "Why would anyone come to hear me, a Negro," she told the Time magazine, "and refuse to sit beside someone just like me? It didn't make any sense." So she was quite known for her demonstrative ways of using her notoriety to stand up for a cause and for a purpose. Artist of the day, take a hint. Also, some of her activism resulted in legal issues and legal troubles. As a matter of fact, in 1949, Scott brought a suit against the owners of Pasco, Washington. It was a restaurant when a waitress refused to serve her and her traveling companions, Mrs. Eunice Wolfe, because they were, quote unquote, Negroes. So Ms. Scott's victory helped African Americans challenge racial discrimination in Spokane, as well as inspiring civil rights organizations to pressure the Washington State Legislature to enact the Public Accommodations Act in 1953. This was the 1950s we're talking about. We're talking about a star who evolved from the 1930s to the 40s and rolled right into 1953. So what was going on in that decade? Well, we had McCarthyism going on, and they were doing a witch hunt for their perceived enemies, the communists. So with the advent of the Red Scare in the television industry, Scott's name appeared in the Red Channels, a report on communist influence in radio and television, in June of 1950. Scott voluntarily appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee. HUAC, yes, you heard me right. The House Un-American Activities Committee. Sounds like something that we need today, right? Here in 2020. But Scott insisted on reading a prepared statement before this committee. She denied that she was a communist. She was ever knowingly connected with the Communist Party or any of its front organizations, but said that she had supported Communist Party member Benjamin Davis's run for city council, arguing that Davis was supported by socialists, a group that has hated communists longer and more fiercely than any other. So I guess that's alluding that she was of a socialist democratic standpoint as opposed to a communist. Her television variety program, The Hazel Scott Show, was canceled a week after Scott appeared on this committee in September of 1950. So, of course, I imagine having her TV show shut down, which was, I'm sure, was a prime source of her livelihood at that time, had its resulting effects on her well-being. And shortly after that, I think the following year, she suffered a health crisis. Actually, she suffered a nervous breakdown that year. So, well, in honor of that, in tribute to that struggle, as I said, women in jazz, even in that decade, suffered many challenges, discrimination, and just difficult times to try to do their music. So why don't we take a pause and play a song that she composed and performed? Well, I think that this life event calls for some blues. Ladies and gentlemen, here is the fabulously talented Miss Hazel Scott singing Nightmare Blues. Ooh, I have to say, she had a right to sing the blues. hmm So let's listen to her tune called Nightmare Blues.
I can't sleep in the morning, and I lie awake all night long. My head's aching, my hands are shaking, everything I do is wrong. Since my daddy left me, all that I had is gone. He said that he still loved me, but I knew it wasn't so. He started getting restless, and I started feeling low. Just what he planned on doing, I really didn't know. Till he packed his things and left me, and I had to let him go. Then I discovered life is a long nightmare. When you've lost your lover, blues hit you everywhere. I don't go to any parties. I walk the floor at home. I'm scared of meeting people. I would rather be alone. I play the same old records, the ones he left behind. And I sit and kiss his picture till I'm about to lose my mind. I discovered nobody seems to care.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate to have the only child of the union between Reverend Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and Miss Hazel Scott with us today for this tribute episode to the late, great, illustrious, multi-talented Hazel Scott. So, television and radio fans, help me in welcoming Mr. Adam Clayton Powell III.
Thank you for having me.
It's an honor, indeed a pleasure, and thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate this, sir. How are you doing?
Fine, fine. It's a little bit of summer here right now.
Right, you're out there in California. What part of California are you in?
Actually, I'm just outside of Washington, D.C.
Oh, you're in D.C. now. That's right. Okay, excellent. Well, we're here in Philadelphia, and we're experiencing some summer-like weather too here. Your parents, their love affair was a New York City society hot topic. And Adam, I have to say, you have been a love child.
Not the way that phrase is usually used, but they certainly were in love, but I certainly was not conceived until months after they were married.
Right. Well, when I was doing my research into your parents, all the photos of them certainly do show that they were very much in love. And so I dare say again, you are a love child.
In that sense, very much so.
Go ahead. All right. Well, where were you born, actually?
In New York City, in Sydenham Hospital, a hospital which was torn down by Ed Koch when he was mayor, and my mother never forgave him.
Would you be so kind as to share with us some of your earliest memories of being the firstborn child of Congressman and Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and the wonderful pianist Miss Hazel Scott. What was that like for you?
Well, my earliest memory is of being only taking a nap and being only halfway down the bed. So I must have been, what, 3 years old, 2 years old? And my mother was practicing downstairs. And she was practicing a phrase over and over and over. And I kept thinking, just get to the next phrase, get to the next note. But it was, this may seem odd, but to a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, they were mom and dad, and they wanted it that way. You know, our next door neighbor was a dentist. Across the street was a conductor in the New York City Railroad, New York Central Railroad. And so, you know, my dad commuted to Washington, and my mom sometimes flew around the country playing in concert halls. And it wasn't until I was probably 6 or 7 that I realized quite how prominent they were.
So when did you get to start traveling with mom?
Oh, let's see. Probably not until I was 11 or 12. I used to carry her sheet music for her musicians. And sometimes she had arrangements for a big band for 16, 20 musicians that would back her up. Sometimes it was just a trio. One of my earliest memories of actually seeing her perform was with the Hazel Scott Trio in 1950. So I would have been 4 years old. And the trio was my mother and Mingus and Max Roach. Not bad.
Whoa. Ah, the best. The best. I listened to some of those tunes that they did together too. You know. Your mother was a boss with the hot sauce for sure. Sure. And so, what are some of your fondest memories of, you know, hanging out with your multi-talented mother in her? Were you around when she was doing her TV show and her film?
Yes, absolutely. Her TV show was on at 7:45, and so it was just I could go on a Friday because it wasn't a school night, and I could actually I did a duet with her on the show. And I was joking with someone that that's the only time in my life I've ever been backed up by Mingus and Max Roach. But her TV show was quite memorable to me because there she was, relaxed and as if she were in our living room with I don't know, the Ellington Band or the Basie Band coming to visit, or some other musician friends. It was a very relaxed atmosphere, and I've been able to read some of the reviews now of it, and they said that she was a very sophisticated performer, which is quite correct. There's also a very interesting bit of television history here, which isn't well known. I didn't know it. In addition to being the first African-American woman to have her own network TV show, there are now some scholars, and somebody's just written a book that'll be out shortly, saying that my mother's TV show invented the variety show on television. That later Perry Como and Ed Sullivan and all the others copied things that were on her show, which is fascinating.
Very much so. I was telling my audience that she made at least maybe 5 or 6 films in Hollywood. The first 2 films were with MGM. Do you remember any of those films, or were you around when she was doing that?
No, I wasn't on the scene yet. She had given up, or rather had been expelled from Hollywood before I was born. But those movies have now become much better known today than maybe 20 years ago because they're all on YouTube. And people can see her playing the 2 pianos, which Alicia Keys did as a sort of a shout out to my mother on the Grammys. So her movies from the 1940s, where, according to Variety, she was the highest paid African American performer in America. And you look at the numbers, today they'd be millions of dollars, but she was incredibly popular and had her own network radio show before she went to Hollywood. But she would always describe herself as, well, I remember her wonderful line. She said, "You know, when your mother went to Hollywood, she was a holy terror."
Who said that?
My mother.
Yeah, and I think she often performed with the great late Lena Horne.
Oh, yes. Growing up, I had two aunts. They weren't really, related. Was Aunt Lena, and the other was Billie Holiday, because they were always by the house, or when we were in Paris, they would always be at the apartment. And I believe I took the last photograph of Billie Holiday before she died. She was in our dining room.
Whoa.
And I think Quincy Jones was sleeping in the next room.
Yeah, it sounds like, African-American artists and musicians in those times, they bonded together, because, they really didn't have the respect of being a first-class citizen, and they supported one another. In terms of traveling, they had to stay with one another, they supported one another, and it was really like a family, community of musicians and artists.
Absolutely. It was like an extended family.
Yes, it was. So your mother moved from MGM, and then she went to Columbia Pictures, and made some pictures for that. And that's when she became, quote unquote, the Holy Terror, because she was very demonstrative with her stance on civil rights.
Oh, absolutely. The incident which really ended her Hollywood career was when she was filming a movie. Again, this is during World War II, and part of her contract said she could never wear a maid's uniform or any other uniform except the uniform of the U.S. Armed Services. And so she was, her role was as a Women's Army Corps officer. And the scene they were filming was she was drilling these guys in a dance routine on the deck of the battleship as they're about to sail off to the Pacific to war. And there were a number of actresses there to see their husbands and boyfriends off to war. The director who was supposed to shoot the scene was ill that day. And the person who substituted for him decided that, here are all these African-American women. To make them realistic, we have to put them in maid's uniforms. And my mother said, "Excuse me, no self-respecting woman is going to come to see her husband or boyfriend sail off to the Pacific to war wearing a maid's uniform." And she refused to shoot the scene until they changed the uniform. So they changed the wardrobe. Word got up to the studio boss, and it's a cliche, but it really is true in Hollywood. This is like the kiss of death. They said, "Hazel Scott is holding up production." And she said, excuse me, and then the studio boss said, "She's not going to make another movie as long as I live." Mm-hmm. Now, there's a scary PS to this. Years later, 14, 15 years later, she's living in Paris. I was with her in Paris from 1958 to 1960. And I used to leave the Paris Herald Tribune newspaper by the front door of the apartment so she could pick it up when she walked in. And she was very excited because for the first time since her Hollywood days, she was making a movie in France, in French, with Jean Gabin, who at that time was the leading French movie star. And in fact, that movie was released in 1958 on May the 19th. And the reason I know that is I just happened to see it in my date book. So this would have been months before that. She was, for the first time, at a studio filming a major picture. And the first day of filming had ended, and she came home. The studio car brought her home. And she walked in, and I was doing my homework, and I heard my mother scream. And I said, "Oh my goodness, what's happened?" I jumped up, and I ran to the front door, and she was at the front door staring down at the newspaper. I said, "What's the matter?" She said, look at the front page. What's the matter? President Eisenhower had done something. She said, no, bottom right corner. The studio boss who said that she wouldn't make another movie as long as he lived, he had dropped dead the day before.
Another interesting story about your mother's stance in civil rights. She experienced the lunch counter kind of a syndrome where she went to a restaurant and sat down, expected to be served with her good friend Miss Eunice Wolf, and the waitress refused to serve her. Did you hear about that story too?
Oh yes, she used to say. My mother used to say that this happened in the state of Washington, in the northern part of the state. My mother used to say if we were any further north, we would have been in Canada. So she said it's not just in the South that you face this. And she sued and won. And people, including my father, said, "Well, why are you bothering with this? This is just some." And she said, "No, they have to understand that they can't discriminate against black people who come to visit."
Exactly. So then, well, I don't think people realize that the battle for civil rights started far before the illustrious incident of the Rosa Parks demonstration.
Oh yeah, there were many years of struggle.
Exactly. Speaking of struggle, remember when the communist scare hit America and McCarthyism was rampant? That whole situation with being afraid of communism in this country affected your mother's career greatly, did it not?
Oh, absolutely. Her television show actually had a very good audience. The audiences were going up. The reviews were good. And then she appeared in this book, or she was mentioned in this book called Red Channels, which was supposed to be a list of performers who were communists. And she was livid. She insisted on testifying at the House On-American Activities Committee. And I remember my father saying, you can't win. You go before those people, they will just do whatever they can to ruin you. And she wouldn't have any part. She insisted on going and reading a statement because she called them, the committee was un-American. So she went before them and testified. Everything was going well on the show, but the sponsors got nervous. And so the network not only canceled the show, they tried to destroy every copy of the film. Videotape hadn't been invented yet, and each program was filmed for replay later. They tried to destroy every copy of the show. And for years, we thought they had succeeded, but maybe about 5-10 years ago, I ran into the producer of a documentary about Mingus, and when I introduced myself, he said, "You're Hazel's son." I said, "Yes." He said, "We found the show." I said, "But the network said that they destroyed all the copies." They forgot it ran in Canada. The Canadians recorded it. So the Library of Congress, in honor of my mother's 100th birthday on June 11th, they are working with the Canadians to obtain their copies of the show. And this is going to be remarkable to see something which is from 1950. It'll be just a fascinating bit of history to watch it. It's amazing that years later, she was a regular on All My Children on the ABC daytime show. And one of the cameramen on All My Children came over to her and said, "You don't remember me, do you?" She said, No. He said, "I was a cameraman on your TV show in 1950. And this would have been in, in the 1970s. So it was 25 years later. And he said, your director insisted on all these crazy shots. And so we had to actually physically lift the camera and tilt it, which he said actually caused some people to really have major strains. But we got these crazy shots. And of course, later these shots became standard in when you were shooting a pianist. So again, that's, I guess, more evidence that her show actually invented some of the techniques that became standard later.
Right. Your mother's mother, your grandmother, was also an excellent musician and band leader herself. So you have all this music in your maternal line. Did any of it rub off on you, Adam?
Not really. It skipped a generation. My older son is a very good. He's a very good pianist. Well, my mother taught him. He's a very good pianist, and he also plays the French horn, which she always said, that's an impossible instrument. Why is he trying to learn that?
Very good. Well, segueing back to the 1950s, I imagine that after that Un-American committee and their attempts to derail your mother's career had some impact on her because she just suffered a health malady shortly afterwards, correct?
Well, I think people don't understand how much of a strain it is just to perform at the level that she would perform. And so she was always, she wasn't a large person. She weighed maybe, 110, 120. And the amount of effort she would put into performing really kept her health sort of marginal much of the time. And in fact, she once said that my favorite prescription that I ever had from a doctor was, "You're too thin. Have a chocolate milkshake." But it was serious a couple of times. Yes, I can remember 2 or 3 times when she had serious health issues. Once was in Las Vegas. She was performing in Las Vegas, and I flew out to make certain she was okay. And in Vegas, she was doing 3 shows in the main room and I think 4 shows a night in the lounge. And
wow,
that just drained you.
Yeah. That's unfathomable. We don't even do that today as entertainers. We don't work that hard, I tell you. But on her return to her full health afterwards, she played with Charles Mingus and Max Wiltz in that famous trio. And she continued to perform in the United States and Europe, and was even getting sporadic bookings on television shows such as Cavalcade of Stars. The Cavalcade of Stars. I don't know if you remember that TV show. But she went back to performing on television after that health malady she suffered in 1951. So she was quite the trooper indeed.
Yeah, she performed a great deal on television in Europe, which was in many ways behind the U.S. in terms of how it was done. Typically, there was only 1, maybe 2 channels in each country, and but she would be very much the star. Once I was with her in Rome when she did a TV show there, and she was wearing what she usually wore, and the assistant director came running out of the control room with a bunch of cloths, and he was stuffing it around her neck. And she said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "The Pope is watching."
Oh, wow, that's hilarious. Thanks for sharing that story with us. I happen to be an admirer of your dad, I remember reading Ebony magazine as a young person and seeing his picture always plastered on it and stories about him. He was quite the activist in New York at the time, representing the causes and concerns of African Americans of the day.
Yes, he was another person. This was a marriage of 2 people who didn't suffer racists gladly. And when he was elected to Congress, he was told by other members of Congress that, well, you're not really able to eat in the House dining room with the rest of us because, well, we're in the South. So what did he do? He actually, in the movie that my brother and I produced about him, we had him we portrayed him as taking a secretary, an African-American secretary to the House dining room. What we left out was he also brought 2 football stars, biggest, darkest people he could find, to make certain that his fellow members of Congress understood that he was integrating the House of Representatives dining room.
Yeah, he's very strong. And I noticed that he brought his religious Baptist minister characteristic flair to his office, which I succinctly see that he got that from your grandfather, Adam Clayton Powell Sr.
There's a book, a biography of my father written by Will Haygood, who at the time was a reporter in Boston. Now he's a reporter here in Washington. And he spent years and years writing the book. And I finally called him. I said, have you given up? And he said, no, you gave me 80 people to talk to, and each of them gave me 80 people to talk to. And he said, by the way, I spent months in West Virginia. I don't think you know how many relatives you have in West Virginia. Your grandfather wasn't kidding when he said he was a hellraiser before he became a minister.
Wow. The pictorial history of your parents' whirlwind marriage, love, and romance are so inspiring, and they stay together for a good period of time. And so I was wondering, like, when the divorce happened, how did that affect you and your mother?
Well, the divorce came many years after they separated. I remember distinctly the separation. We had gone to Europe each year, starting in the fall of 1950, and my father would do surprise inspections of American military bases in Europe, and my mother would perform at the London Palladium and Salle Pleyel and the major concert halls of Europe. And we went back in the summer of 1951, 1952, 1953, 1954. And at the end of the summer of 1954, it was time for us to go back to the United States. And my mother's European manager, my goodness, I'm remembering his name now. His name was Felix Marijuani. He said, Hazel, if you stay just one more week, I can get you another date at the Sarah Bernhardt, huge concert hall in Paris. And she said, oh, okay, I'll stay another week. So my father and I went back to New York, and every week or two she would send a telegram saying, Felix has another date for me here. I'm going to stay another week. And finally, after a couple of months, she sent for her piano, her concert grand piano, and my father said, "Son, I don't think she's coming back, at least not for a while." And it was seeing them separately, because I would spend part of the year with my father in New York and part of the year with my mother in Europe. They would always speak fondly of each other. So it always puzzled me at the time, why aren't they together? But they eventually, let's see, I guess it was the 1960, 1961, so it was some years later that they formally divorced.
Right, I know. And your dad actually remarried, correct?
Yes, he married Yvette Diago, and they had a son, Adam IV, and he entered politics. He served in the New York City Council, New York State Assembly, and had a political career, and is now a business management consultant in New York.
Wow. Yeah, I saw pictures of him. You guys all look alike. Did your mom remarry?
Yes, she married another performer named Ezio Bedin, who was a Italian-Swiss dual citizen. And we did not know until I was organizing things in my mother's apartment after she died, and we found she had a Swiss passport, which I'd never seen her use. I'd never seen it. And Swiss passports are very, very difficult to get. So Ezio obviously was able to, as her husband was able to arrange for her to have a Swiss passport. But she Ezio was a comedian and an impressionist, and a lot of fun. But I still remember my mother died not being an American citizen, which few people realize. She was coming back from a concert in Montreal, if I recall. And she arrived at Kennedy Airport, and she called me because the immigration people would not let her into the United States. They said that she was no longer a citizen. And she called me. I was at my office in Midtown, and I said, I'll come right out to the airport. And they said that a quote-unquote routine check they had discovered that her mother, my mother's mother, when they arrived in the United States in 1924, hadn't checked one of the boxes on the immigration form. And so my mother was not an American citizen. And she said, fine, I want my taxes back. That didn't happen, but she needed a passport. And she said, great, let's go to the Trinidadian consulate, and I want a Trinidadian passport. So we looked in the phone book and couldn't find the phone number for the Trinidadian consulate. I said, well, let's go to the British consulate on Park Avenue. They'd certainly know where it is. It used to be a British colony. And so we went to the British consulate in New York, went up the stairs, and there was this central casting British official who said, Madam, how can I help you? And she said, we want to go to the Trinidadian consulate to so that I can have a passport. And he looked at her and he said, Madam, what is your birth date? And she said, June 11, 1920. 1920. Oh, let me look this up. 1920. Now, Trinidad wasn't independent until decades later. So he said, 1920. You were born a British subject. You shall have a British passport. And they gave her a passport on the spot.
That's right. Trinidad was a British colony. I forgot.
She was not happy with that. She said, we're free, we're free.
She had quite the sense of humor, which apparently you've inherited. That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that story. That's what we're trying to do, find the humor in all the struggle that we know that our ancestors went through in those early decades of trying to be artistically expressive in this country. I was wondering, if you could identify a few adjectives to express the nature and the character of your illustrious mother, what would you choose to say about your mother and her lifelong pursuit of music?
Oh, the first one that comes to mind is fearless. She had absolutely no fear. If she knew that she was right, she had no fear. She would just do whatever it would take, even if it was not good for her career. She also was amazingly creative in ways that I've only come to appreciate in the years after she died, discovering things in her apartment, hearing stories from some of her close friends, Dizzy Gillespie and Quincy Jones especially. She was very active in not just music. She was in Dance Theater of Harlem is actually creating a ballet based on my mother's life.
You've been watching the Women in Jazz series with your hostess, with the mostest, Khadija Renee, local jazz diva on the Philadelphia Jazz Scene. Tune in next time. We'll see you. Until then, be safe. Namaste.
Life can be brutal and you might get pissed. Here's the solution. Unclench your fist. You'll make out better if you just be cool. You better chill, 'cause that's the deal. You better chill. chivalry.